At 61, Evelyn Mercer walked out of the job she'd held for nearly 4 decades with a cardboard box in her arms, almost no savings, and absolutely no retirement plan. Her rent was about to rise. Her future frightened her, and for the first time in her life, she had nowhere certain to go. Then she did something even she couldn't fully explain. She spent $300 on an abandoned toll house at the edge of a forgotten Pennsylvania road. A rotting little building with a leaking roof, no working heat, and decades of weeds swallowing the old gate. People laughed when they heard what she'd bought. One neighbor told her she'd paid $300 for a problem that should have been demolished for free. But Evelyn wasn't looking for an investment. She was looking for somewhere she could afford to grow old. Then, while repairing a sealed section of wall behind the kitchen, she heard something heavy fall inside it. Hidden between the boards was a wooden box containing a stack of 19th century stagecoach payment records. Records that were never supposed to be there. At first, they looked like nothing more than faded names, dates, and toll amounts. Until Evelyn noticed the same strange word beside dozens of journeys paid. There was only one problem. No money had been collected for any of them. And beside every one was the same pair of initials, R.M. When Evelyn discovered who those initials belonged to and why someone had hidden these records inside the toll house, the story she'd been told about her own family began to fall apart. But before we open that ledger, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Wherever you are, whether you're starting your morning, taking a quiet afternoon break, or listening late at night, I hope you have a wonderful day ahead. And if you enjoy forgotten places, buried family histories, and ordinary people whose stories deserve to be remembered, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's go back to the day Evelyn Mercer spent her last $300 on a toll house nobody else wanted and found something behind its walls that had been waiting more than a century to be read. At 61, Evelyn Mercer left the office carrying 38 years of her life in a cardboard box. There was a chipped blue mug, 2 pens, a framed photograph of her mother, and the small desk calendar she had stopped updating after the company announced her retirement date. Someone had brought supermarket cake. Her manager shook her hand and told her to enjoy having time for herself. By 4:15, Evelyn was standing alone beside her car, wondering what exactly she was supposed to do with it. Retirement had always existed somewhere beyond the next bill, the next year, the next problem. She had spent years helping her mother, paying rent, and telling herself she would make a proper plan later. Later had arrived. That evening, Evelyn opened the spreadsheet containing her savings and expenses. She changed the numbers 3 times, hoping she had made a mistake. She hadn't. Then she opened the letter from her landlord again. Her rent would increase in 2 months. Evelyn stared at the new amount until the apartment suddenly felt temporary. For the next week, she searched for cheaper places. Everything affordable seemed either too far away or already taken. Then, buried among county notices, she found a tax-delinquent property sale. Most listings were vacant lots or structures beyond repair. One stopped her. Old Turnpike Toll House. Minimum bid $300. 2 days later, Evelyn drove out to see it. The old road narrowed between trees before bending toward a neglected stone and timber building half hidden behind weeds. One side of the roof sagged. Paint peeled from the window frames. A wooden barrier lay broken beside what had once been the road gate. A man was measuring a rotten porch post when she approached. "You hear about the sale?" he asked. "I was thinking about it." He lowered the tape measure. Daniel Price. He explained that he lived nearby and occasionally did carpentry work around the area. When Evelyn asked whether the house could be lived in, Daniel looked toward the roof. "Eventually." That's not the same as yes. No. He showed her the worst of it: water damage near the rear wall, unreliable plumbing, no usable heating system, and electrical service that had been disconnected. $300 sounds cheap, he said, until the house starts telling you what it needs. Evelyn should have left. Instead, she stepped inside. Dust covered the floorboards, and the rooms smelled of damp wood. Beside the front window stood a narrow counter where travelers had once stopped to pay. Above it, almost hidden beneath grime, was a small brass plate. Evelyn wiped it with her thumb. "Toll 7, original?" she asked. Daniel leaned closer. "Looks like it." For reasons she couldn't explain, Evelyn touched the counter again. She imagined someone sitting there watching wagons approach along a road that barely existed anymore. The building was damaged, inconvenient, and possibly foolish, but it was also the first place she had ever considered that could actually belong to her. At the county sale, Evelyn expected someone to outbid her. Nobody did. When the clerk confirmed the winning bid, she felt less triumphant than terrified. $300 had bought her a toll house and every problem inside it. The following afternoon, she returned with cleaning supplies, bottled water, and the keys. Daniel's warning followed her from room to room as she tested windows and made a list of repairs she could barely afford. Behind the kitchen stood a narrow door covered by boards and old nails. Evelyn tried the handle. Nothing. She pulled harder. Still nothing. She fetched a hammer from her car and worked one nail loose, then another. The board shifted just enough for the door to tremble in its frame. Evelyn pulled once more. Something moved on the other side. There was a short scrape from inside the wall, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy dropping into the darkness behind the boards. Evelyn stood motionless, the hammer still in her hand. Nothing else moved behind the boards. She considered pulling them off herself, then remembered Daniel's warning about the condition of the rear wall. 10 minutes later, she called him. He arrived carrying a pry bar and an expression that suggested he had expected the house to cause trouble sooner or later. "You bought it yesterday," he said. "It waited longer than I expected." Daniel examined the boarded doorway, removed the remaining nails carefully, then pulled away a narrow strip of wood beside the frame. Behind it was not another room, but a shallow cavity between the old interior wall and later paneling. Something rested at the bottom. Evelyn crouched while Daniel shone a flashlight inside. "Looks like a box." They widened the opening enough to reach it. The wooden box was dark with age and coated in dust, but surprisingly intact. Evelyn carried it to the kitchen counter and lifted the stiff lid. No coins, no jewelry, nothing remotely valuable. Inside were several brittle receipts, folded scraps of paper, and a thick ledger bound in faded brown cloth. "My first treasure," Evelyn said. "Oh, bookkeeping?" Daniel smiled. "Probably worth slightly less than the roof you need." Evelyn laughed despite herself. It felt strange. A week earlier, she had been staring at retirement figures as though her life had narrowed into columns of expenses. Now she was standing in a ruined toll house, opening a box someone had deliberately placed inside a wall. Daniel lifted one receipt by its edge. "Don't unfold these." "Why?" "Because they'll become smaller receipts." Evelyn photographed everything where it lay, then called the county library. By afternoon, she was sitting across from Nora Bell, the 38-year-old librarian who also managed the town's small historical collection. Nora wore thin cotton gloves as she examined the ledger beneath a reading lamp. "Late 19th century, she said. "Stagecoach and wagon tolls, most likely. Dates, vehicle types, charges." She pointed to rows of faded handwriting. "This house would have recorded traffic using the old turnpike." Evelyn tried not to sound disappointed. So it really is bookkeeping. Bookkeeping is history when enough time passes. Several pages near the back were stuck together from moisture. Nora warned Evelyn not to separate them. Other pages remained readable, although water stains had swallowed entire columns. Evelyn watched Nora move slowly through entries for wagons, coaches, livestock, and individual riders. Then Evelyn noticed the same word appearing repeatedly beside several journeys. "What does that say?" Nora adjusted the lamp. "Paid." Evelyn leaned closer. Beside the word were two initials written in darker ink. R.M. The notation appeared again 6 lines later, then twice on the next page. Was that the person collecting the toll, Evelyn asked? Possibly. We'd need another record to know. That evening, she brought the ledger back to the toll house in its protective box. Daniel was finishing a temporary covering over the damaged section of roof. Before leaving, he paused beneath the brass Toll 7 plate near the old counter. "Did you notice these?" He removed the plate's loose lower screw and tilted it outward. Scratched into the wood behind it were dozens of short vertical marks arranged in small groups. Evelyn ran a finger close to them without touching. Someone was counting something. Days, maybe, or wagons. Daniel replaced the plate. The marks gave her another question, but the initials bothered her more. That night, Evelyn searched digitized county records until the letters blurred. She found nothing useful. The next morning, Nora called. "I found a register for the turnpike employees," she said. Evelyn sat down on the edge of her unpacked chair. "And the toll keeper listed for this property in 1894 was a woman." Nora paused. Her name was Ruth Mercer. Evelyn asked Nora to repeat the name. "Ruth Mercer," Nora said. "Toll keeper, 1894, same address." Evelyn stared toward the old counter. Mercer was common enough that she told herself it could mean nothing, but she remembered the few family stories her mother had avoided rather than told. That afternoon, Evelyn opened the folder of family papers she had kept after her mother's death. Birth certificates, funeral cards, photographs without dates. On the back of one photograph, in her mother's handwriting, was a simple family line. Evelyn followed it backward until she reached her great-grandfather. His mother's name was Ruth Mercer. Evelyn called an older cousin who had collected family information years earlier. He remembered almost nothing. "Ruth left," he said. That's what everybody said. Left where? Don't know. There was some kind of scandal. Your mother hated talking about it. Evelyn remembered asking as a child why there were no photographs of that branch of the family. Her mother had answered, "Some people are better left in the past." At the time, Evelyn had assumed Ruth had done something shameful. Now she looked at the ledger differently. The initials R.M. were no longer anonymous marks. They belonged to a woman who had sat in this building more than a century earlier, perhaps at the same counter Evelyn had touched on her first visit. Nora helped her begin comparing the hidden ledger with surviving county toll reports. The work was slow. Some records had never been digitized, and several boxes from the period were incomplete. Whole sections are missing. Nora said, "Water damage, poor storage. Maybe things simply got thrown away." They started with dates that remained clear in Ruth's ledger. On October 11, 1894, it recorded 6 wagons and 2 stagecoaches. The county report listed the day's receipts but no individual traffic. October 18th produced another mismatch. Then Nora stopped at November 3rd. Ruth's ledger showed 14 separate entries. Evelyn counted them twice. "What does the county copy say?" Nora turned the register toward her. Beside the date in formal handwriting were 2 words. No traffic. Evelyn felt a small chill. 14 vehicles don't become none by accident. one discrepancy could. Nora said, not necessarily 14. They checked another date. Same problem. Several journeys existed in Ruth's ledger, but vanished from the official report. Many carried the notation, paid RM. The records did not explain why. Back at the toll house, Evelyn told Daniel what they had found. He had come to inspect the kitchen wall before she attempted any more demolition. Until then, he had treated the ledger with amused patience. Something interesting Evelyn had discovered while dealing with a building that needed far more urgent attention. This time he listened without joking. So her private book says people came through, and the county says they didn't, on certain days. Then either her book is wrong or theirs is. That's what Nora said. Daniel studied the old toll counter. Maybe the house has more paperwork. They searched carefully rather than tearing anything apart. Daniel checked joints and panels while Evelyn examined drawers swollen by damp. One narrow drawer beneath the counter refused to open. Daniel removed it and noticed its interior was shallower than the exterior frame. False bottom. Beneath a thin wooden panel lay folded scraps of paper. They contained names, numbers of adults and children, and destinations, small Pennsylvania towns at first, then places farther west. No explanation accompanied them. Evelyn recognized 2 surnames from the ledger. These were people who passed through here. Daniel no longer looked skeptical. Looks that way. Over the next day, Evelyn and Nora compared the names against cemetery lists, census fragments, and local records. Most led nowhere. Then Nora found one. Thomas Calder appeared on Ruth's handwritten list with a wife, 2 children, and a western destination. He also appeared on the town's memorial database. Evelyn read the entry aloud. Thomas Calder, laborer, died 1894. Nora nodded slowly. The memorial marker placed his death locally, months before Ruth's list appeared to record him traveling west. Maybe there were 2 Thomas Calders. Evelyn said. Nora searched the family details. Wife's name matched. 2 children matched. Occupation matched. Evelyn looked again at the faded destination written beside the family. Then how could Ruth record him leaving? Nora didn't answer. The following morning, Evelyn went to the memorial herself. Thomas Calder's name was carved among local dead from that difficult decade, the weathered letters still visible beneath moss. She stood before it longer than she intended. Ruth's hidden paper said this man had passed the toll house with his family. The town's stones said he had never lived long enough to make that journey. For the first time, Evelyn wondered whether the mystery inside her $300 house was not about money at all. It was about people the official record said had never left. The contradiction around Thomas Calder gave Evelyn something concrete to follow. Nora found a marriage record for Calder and his wife, Margaret, then traced one of their children forward through later census records. The trail ended not in Pennsylvania, but in Ohio 3 days later, after several phone calls and messages through a local historical society. Evelyn spoke with an elderly woman named Helen Ward, a great-granddaughter of Thomas Calder. He didn't die in Pennsylvania. Helen said immediately when Evelyn mentioned the memorial, "We have letters from him." Evelyn gripped the phone tighter. Helen agreed to meet. She lived 2 hours west in a small house filled with framed family photographs, many of them labeled carefully on the back. From a metal document box, she removed a letter protected inside a clear sleeve. "This was written after they left," Helen said. "My grandmother kept it. Then my mother—" The paper was fragile and browned along the folds. Thomas described arriving in Ohio with Margaret and the children after weeks of uncertainty. He wrote about finding temporary work, sleeping in a crowded boarding house, and being grateful they had escaped before winter worsened. Then Evelyn reached one sentence and stopped. "Read that again," Helen said. Evelyn did. The woman at the gate let us through. She looked up. Do you know who he meant? Helen shook her head. No name. We always assumed it was someone at a checkpoint or road gate. Evelyn photographed the letter with permission. On the drive back, the sentence repeated in her head. Ruth's ledger had marked the Calder journey as paid. The town's records had effectively erased Thomas by listing him among the dead. Yet Thomas himself had written from Ohio that a woman at a gate had allowed his family through. At the library, Nora placed the photograph of the letter beside Ruth's hidden list. Same wife, same children, same destination direction, she said, and the date fits. Then Ruth wasn't just recording people, she may have been helping them leave. The idea changed the shape of everything. If Ruth had deliberately let families through, why had the county reports shown no traffic, and why had those families been missing or misrepresented in local records? Evelyn returned to the toll house that evening. Daniel was repairing a warped window frame when she arrived. She handed him a printout of the letter. He read the sentence twice. The woman at the gate, he said. You think that's Ruth? I think it could be. Daniel looked toward the old road beyond the window. Then this place wasn't just collecting tolls. Before Evelyn could answer, a truck pulled into the overgrown drive. The man who stepped out was in his 70s, neatly dressed despite the mud. He introduced himself as Harold Vance. Evelyn recognized the surname from several historical references Nora had shown her. The Vance family had once controlled large portions of land around the old turnpike. Harold's eyes moved briefly toward the toll counter before settling on Evelyn. I heard you've been asking questions about old traffic records, he said. I'm trying to understand what happened here. A great deal happened here. Most of it was ordinary. His tone remained polite but guarded. Evelyn mentioned Ruth Mercer and the discrepancies in the ledger. Harold's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Old books are imperfect. People make mistakes. 14 vehicles recorded here, while the county report says none. That was more than a century ago. Evelyn asked whether the Vance family still held records from the Turnpike Company. Harold admitted they did. Could I see them? No. The answer came gently but without hesitation. Then he glanced at the decaying building. You paid $300 for this place, didn't you? Evelyn nodded. Then perhaps treat it as what it is. A small old house. Don't turn bookkeeping errors into a scandal. He left before she could ask anything else. Daniel watched the truck disappear. That sounded less like advice than he intended. Evelyn folded the printout carefully. The next morning, Nora called with another discovery. She had been comparing the dates of every entry marked Paid RM against surviving newspapers and employment notices. They start clustering after one specific event, she said. What event? Nora paused. The local coal mine closed. Hundreds of workers lost their wages almost overnight. Evelyn looked at Ruth's list of families and the destinations written beside their names. Suddenly the gate, the vanished traffic, and Thomas Calder's letter pointed in the same direction. Whatever Ruth had been doing at the toll house had begun when an entire community could no longer afford to stay. Nora found the first useful newspaper notice from January 1894. The coal mine had closed with almost no warning after months of reduced shifts, leaving dozens of families without wages and many already owing money for housing, food, and supplies. Evelyn sat beside her at the library table, reading the brittle reproductions while snow pressed gray light against the windows. The reports were short and impersonal. Men dismissed, accounts unsettled, company housing under review. None of the articles described what those words meant inside a kitchen when there was no money left. Nora pulled another record closer. Look at the dates. Evelyn compared the shutdown notice with Ruth's ledger. before the closure. Paid RM appeared occasionally. Afterward, the notation multiplied. So people were leaving. It looks that way. Nora traced the old route on a county map. The turnpike connected the mining settlement to the road leading toward the nearest rail station. Families trying to leave with wagons would have passed directly through Ruth's toll gate. Evelyn thought of Thomas Calder's letter. "The woman at the gate let us through." She imagined Ruth seeing one wagon after another approach. Children bundled under blankets. Household belongings tied down with rope. People carrying everything they still owned. But if they had no wages, Evelyn said, how were they paying tolls? Nora looked at the ledger. That's the question. That afternoon, Daniel found another problem under the house. He had been checking the floor supports when he called Evelyn outside and showed her a section of foundation where mortar had crumbled away. "This can't wait through winter." She stared at the gap. "How bad?" Daniel gave her a number based on the cheapest repair he thought would be safe. Evelyn's stomach tightened. She had bought the building for $300 because $300 was an amount she could risk. The house itself had no respect for that limit. "I can patch some things," Daniel said, "but the foundation needs real work." Evelyn went inside and opened her retirement spreadsheet again. Roof, heat, electrical service, foundation. Each new line made the future smaller. For the first time since buying the toll house, she seriously considered whether the entire decision had been reckless. Harold Vance arrived the next morning. He did not mention the ledger at first. Instead, he walked around the exterior, studied the sagging porch, and said, "This place will consume whatever money you have." Evelyn disliked that he was probably right. "Did you come to tell me that I came with an offer?" He named a price several times what she had paid. Not enough to change her life, but enough to erase the mistake cleanly. She could return to looking for an apartment, protect what remained of her savings, and stop worrying about a century-old building. "Why do you want it?" she asked. Harold glanced toward the old road. "My family has had connections to this property for generations. I would rather see it handled properly, meaning quietly." His expression hardened slightly. "Meaning sensibly." Evelyn asked for time. After he left, she sat alone at the toll counter and tried to decide whether curiosity was worth financial insecurity. The ledger rested nearby inside its protective box. She opened it carefully, not because she expected an answer, but because Ruth's precise handwriting had begun to feel strangely familiar. Someone else had once sat here counting small amounts of money while the world outside changed faster than expected. Nora arrived later with copies of wage records from the turnpike company. Together they compared them with the ledger. Ruth's salary had been modest. The families passing through after the mine closure had even less. "Maybe the toll company waived fees," Evelyn said. Nora shook her head. "Then the official reports should say so." They examined the loose receipts from the wooden box again. Most were too damaged to read. One remained folded near the ledger's broken binding, as though it had slipped between the pages years ago. Nora eased it free and flattened it beneath a clear sheet. The ink was faded, but the printed heading was still visible. Turnpike receipt. Below it was a handwritten amount. Evelyn recognized the date. It matched one of the busiest days in Ruth's ledger, a day filled with paid RM entries. Nora read the payer line slowly. Ruth Mercer. Evelyn leaned closer. Beneath the name were the words, "Personal account." They checked the amount against the toll entries from that date. Nora added the charges once. Then again. The totals matched. Evelyn felt something shift inside her understanding of the records. The notation had never meant that the families themselves had paid. Ruth had recorded the toll as paid because someone had covered it. She used her own money. Evelyn whispered, Nora looked at the receipt, then at the ledger. It appears she did. Evelyn thought of the families leaving after the mine closed, of Thomas Calder's children riding west under blankets, and of a woman at a wooden gate who apparently refused to let poverty become the reason they could not pass. The toll house suddenly seemed more expensive than $300 and far more valuable than Harold's offer. Evelyn touched the edge of the receipt without lifting it. Ruth Mercer had not simply opened the gate, at least at first. She had paid for every person who could not. Evelyn and Nora spent most of the next 2 days testing the idea against every record they could find. One receipt proving Ruth had paid a day's tolls from her own account was significant, but Evelyn wanted to know whether it had happened once or repeatedly. They started with the dates marked most heavily paid RM in the hidden ledger, then searched for corresponding receipts, payroll entries, and surviving turnpike summaries. Records were too damaged to use. Others contained only totals, but slowly a pattern emerged. Whenever the ledger showed a cluster of families moving through without ordinary payment entries, Ruth's personal deposits rose. The amounts were never large by themselves. A few cents here, a little more for a loaded wagon, yet together they consumed a striking portion of her wages. Nora wrote the figures in 2 columns. Look, Evelyn leaned closer. Ruth's salary appeared on one side. Her personal payments into toll receipts appeared on the other. She was giving most of it back. Evelyn said, by the end of the year, almost all of it. Evelyn sat back. The discovery unsettled her more than she expected. For years, she had spent money and time caring for her mother, postponing trips, postponing savings, postponing choices she assumed she would make later. She had told herself there had never been another option. Ruth's situation felt uncomfortably different. Nothing in the records suggested anyone had forced her to cover those fares. Why would she keep doing it? Evelyn asked. Nora closed one register. Maybe because she decided someone had to. Back at the toll house, Daniel was working with salvaged timber to reinforce a damaged interior section without replacing more original wood than necessary. Evelyn told him what they had confirmed. He rested his hammer on the floor. So the people weren't cheating the toll. No. And Ruth wasn't stealing from the company. No. She was paying them herself. Daniel whistled quietly. That's a hard way to make a living. Evelyn looked toward the old counter. It wasn't much of a living by the end. Daniel studied her for a moment. You sound angry about it. I don't know what I am. She rubbed her hands together for warmth. She gave almost everything away. You think that was foolish? Evelyn didn't answer immediately. I think spending your whole life for other people can become a habit. Daniel nodded once, as if he understood there was more behind the sentence than Ruth. Then he returned to measuring the timber. Habit and choice aren't always the same thing. The words stayed with Evelyn that afternoon. Daniel showed her how he planned to use reclaimed boards from a collapsed shed at the rear of the property instead of buying new lumber. It would not solve the foundation problem, but it would reduce the cost of several smaller repairs. Evelyn helped pull old nails from the boards while he trimmed the usable sections. The work was slow and practical. Exactly the kind of problem she could understand. One board saved, one expense reduced, one room made safer. By evening, her hands ached, but for once, she had not checked her retirement spreadsheet. The next morning, Nora called with a different kind of record. I found the turnpike payroll for the end of 1894. Evelyn drove to the library. The figures confirmed what they already suspected. Ruth's nominal wage continued, but deductions and personal toll payments left almost nothing in her hands. Some weeks, she had effectively worked for pennies, and she continued into the following years. Nora said, the PAAD notation doesn't stop. Then why was she eventually removed? That's what I can't find. They searched employee records for disciplinary notes. Nothing. They checked minutes from turnpike meetings, but several years were incomplete. Evelyn felt the investigation hit a wall. They knew what Ruth had done, but not what consequence it had carried. That gap mattered. If Ruth had simply left, the old family story about scandal might still contain some separate truth. Nora suggested they look through municipal meeting archives rather than company files. The town had occasionally discussed road access and transport disputes when the mine collapse affected local families. Hours passed. Evelyn read pages of faded minutes about culverts, repairs, unpaid assessments, and property claims. Then Nora stopped turning pages. Evelyn. Her voice had changed. Evelyn moved beside her. The entry was dated 1897. Most of the paragraph concerned Turnpike administration. But one sentence stood apart because Mercer was underlined in the original hand. Nora read it once silently, then aloud. Mercer woman removed for deliberate violation. Evelyn stared at the words. Violation of what? It doesn't say. There was no explanation beneath it. No charge, no description of theft, fraud, or misconduct. Just the sentence. Evelyn read it again. Ruth had spent years paying other people's tolls from her own wages. Now, 3 years later, someone had formally removed her for doing something deliberate. The records had finally told Evelyn that Ruth was punished. They still refused to say exactly what she had chosen to do. Evelyn returned to Harold Vance because the single sentence in the 1897 meeting record was not enough. Mercer woman removed for deliberate violation. It told her Ruth had been punished, but not what rule she had broken. Harold listened without interrupting as Evelyn explained what she and Nora had confirmed about the personal toll payments. When she finished, he remained silent for several seconds. You knew she was dismissed, Evelyn said. I knew the family papers mentioned a toll keeper being removed, and you didn't think that mattered when I asked to see them? I thought old disputes were better left where they were. Evelyn looked at him steadily. They're already here. Harold glanced toward the toll house behind her, then finally agreed to let her examine a limited portion of the Vance family archive. The documents were kept in labeled boxes in a room at his house. Many of them business letters from the years when his ancestors held financial interests in the turnpike. Nora joined Evelyn for the review. At first, they found nothing beyond routine correspondence about road repairs, toll rates, and overdue accounts. Then Nora unfolded a letter dated early 1897. It was addressed to Ruth Mercer. The language was formal but unmistakable. Ruth was ordered to stop allowing passage to families whose tolls remained unpaid or whose debts were connected to properties controlled by local creditors. Evelyn read the sentence twice. So they knew. Harold stood across the table. Apparently, they knew people were trying to leave, yes. Another letter followed several weeks later. This one was sharper. Ruth was instructed to keep the gate secured after dark and to record every traveler without exception. Evelyn thought of the hidden ledger and the repeated paid RM entries. She didn't obey. Nora turned several pages of copied records. Traffic continued. Harold exhaled slowly. Then that's likely the violation. Evelyn looked at him. Not theft, not fraud. She refused to stop people. That's what these documents suggest. His choice of words irritated her. Suggest. Harold's face tightened. You want me to condemn people who have been dead for more than 100 years based on letters I had never studied this closely? I want you to admit what they say. Silence settled across the room. Finally, Harold nodded. They say my family wanted the gate closed to people who owed money. They say Ruth Mercer refused. It was not an apology, but it was the first time he had stopped defending the old story. Nora found a smaller folded sheet tucked behind the second letter. It was written in Ruth's hand. Most of the note concerned ordinary toll accounting, but one line had been added near the bottom. Evelyn recognized the writing from the ledger immediately. A debt should not become a wall. She read the sentence aloud. Harold lowered his eyes. Evelyn felt something inside her settle. Ruth had not been confused. She had not made bookkeeping mistakes. She understood exactly what she was doing. Outside, rain had begun tapping against the windows. Evelyn remembered how her own family had reduced Ruth to a Warren, a woman who left in disgrace. No one had preserved this sentence. No one had said she lost her position because she refused to turn desperate families back toward a town where they had no wages and nowhere secure to live. Harold brought out one final folder. There may be something else. Inside was the formal termination notice. Ruth Mercer was removed from her position effective immediately for repeated violation of toll collection procedures and refusal to comply with direct instructions concerning after-hours passage. Evelyn read it slowly, repeated. Nora nodded. So they warned her more than once. Harold looked toward the papers. My family always described the matter as insubordination. Maybe it was, Evelyn said. That doesn't make her wrong. Harold did not argue. Instead, he asked what Evelyn intended to do with the information. She told him she wanted the history recorded accurately. She was not interested in turning his ancestors into monsters, but she would not pretend Ruth had simply vanished in shame. Harold hesitated, then agreed that Nora could make copies of the relevant papers. It was a small concession, but Evelyn understood what it cost him. As they prepared to leave, Nora paused over the termination notice. Wait. Attached to the back was a final accounting sheet for the toll house. The dismissal date was clearly marked. Nora opened Ruth's hidden ledger to the same week. Evelyn leaned over her shoulder. The entries continued after the notice. One day later, there were more lines than on any page they had seen from that year. Evelyn counted them once, then again. 27. Nora checked the date against the termination order. She had already been fired. Harold moved closer. Evelyn traced the column without touching the paper. 27 separate stagecoach and wagon entries had passed through the toll house on the day after Ruth Mercer was formally removed. Whatever instructions she had been given, whatever consequences she already faced, she had opened the gate again. Evelyn returned to the toll house with copies of the Vance letters, Ruth's termination notice, and the knowledge that 27 vehicles had passed through after Ruth had already been fired. The number bothered her more than any earlier discrepancy. 27 was not a bookkeeping mistake. It was a decision repeated 27 times. Nora joined her the next morning, and together they compared the final page of the hidden ledger with every surviving document from that week. Most of the entries were brief: wagon, family, 2 horses, destination, west. Several names matched families who had lost housing after the mine closure. Others appeared on Ruth's handwritten list from the false bottom drawer. None showed ordinary toll payments. Did she cover these too? Evelyn asked. Nora checked the payroll records again, then shook her head. She couldn't have. By then, she had almost nothing left. That afternoon, they found a letter preserved in a descendant's collection and later copied into a local archive. The writer had been a young woman traveling with her parents on the same date as Ruth's final ledger entries. Her account was short, written years later. But one detail was unmistakable. Rain had fallen heavily that night. Families were waiting on the road with wagons loaded for departure. The toll keeper had already been dismissed. Yet she remained at the gate until morning. Evelyn read the passage twice. The woman described Ruth lifting the wooden barrier for each wagon and refusing payment from people who had none to give. No speeches, no confrontation. Just the gate rising again and again in the rain. Daniel stood beside Evelyn at the old counter while she told him what the letter said. He looked toward the broken remains of the original barrier outside. So that was her last night here. It looks like it. And she knew she'd lost the job. Yes. Evelyn imagined Ruth alone after the official notice, knowing the company wanted the road controlled, knowing her own wages were gone, and still choosing to remain until those families passed. The story her mother had inherited suddenly seemed almost cruel in its simplicity. Ruth left in disgrace. That was how a lifetime of choices had been reduced. She had not abandoned the town because of shameful conduct. She had been pushed out after refusing to close a gate on people who had nowhere else to go. Nora found one more supporting account in a family letter from the same winter. It mentioned Mercer at the toll helping households reach the road west before creditors could stop them. The details were plain enough to connect the pieces without turning Ruth into something larger than she had been. She had not organized a rebellion. She had not exposed a grand conspiracy. She had done the work in front of her, one family at a time, until the people above her made that impossible. Evelyn sat in the room where Ruth had once kept the ledger. The damaged wall behind the kitchen was still open, the wooden box resting nearby. For weeks, every discovery had produced another practical question. Who paid, who left, why were the records wrong? This time, the answer was almost painfully simple. Ruth had paid while she could. When she could no longer pay, she opened the gate anyway. Evelyn covered her face with both hands. The tears surprised her. They were not exactly grief. She had never known Ruth. They came from the sudden reversal of something she had carried since childhood. A woman she had been taught to regard as an embarrassment had made a choice Evelyn could understand even if she was not sure she could have made it herself. Daniel did not interrupt. He simply sat on the other side of the counter until Evelyn lowered her hands. I spent years thinking she must have done something terrible, Evelyn said. You were told half a story, less than half. She looked toward the brass Toll 7 plate and the marks hidden behind it. She stayed until the last people got through. Nora arrived later with photographs of the final ledger page taken under better light. While examining the back, she noticed faint writing that had been nearly invisible beneath staining. Evelyn carried the ledger carefully to the window as Nora angled a lamp across the paper. There, in Ruth's hand, was a single address. No explanation, no name other than her own initials, just a street and town several counties away. Evelyn stared at it. Could this be where she went? Nora nodded slowly. It might be. For the first time, the records inside the toll house did not point backward to the gate. They pointed beyond it, toward the life Ruth had lived after she walked away. The address on the back of Ruth's final ledger page led Nora to records in a town several counties away. Evelyn expected another dead end. Instead, they found Ruth almost immediately. A census placed her there 5 years after she left the toll house, renting a room near the railroad station and working at a boarding house. Later directories kept her at the same address for more than 2 decades. She didn't disappear. Evelyn said, No. Nora replied, She just disappeared from the story your family kept. They drove there 2 days later and spent the morning in a small historical archive near the old station. The boarding house itself was gone, replaced long ago by a commercial building. But city directories and newspaper notices survived. Ruth had worked first as a housekeeper, then as the woman responsible for receiving boarders. Many were laborers and families newly arrived by rail. There was no evidence she became wealthy or prominent. Her life after the toll house appeared ordinary. Evelyn found that strangely comforting. Ruth had not needed a dramatic reward for what she had done. Near closing time, Nora located an obituary, Ruth Mercer had died more than 30 years after leaving the turnpike. The notice was only a few paragraphs. It listed no husband, no fortune, no public honors. Then Evelyn reached the final line describing how neighbors remembered her. Her door was rarely closed to anyone in need. Evelyn stopped reading. She thought of the toll gate in the rain, then of another doorway years later, this one near a railway station. Ruth's life had changed, but apparently the choice at its center had not. On the drive home, Evelyn watched towns pass outside the window and considered how easily one sentence could replace an entire person. Ruth left in disgrace. That version had survived for generations. The receipts, letters, payroll, termination notice, and stagecoach records told something different. Ruth had used her wages to cover tolls for families who could not pay. When ordered to stop, she refused. When dismissed, she opened the gate one final night. Then she built another life, back at the library. Nora organized copies of every supporting document. "We have enough to establish the history," she said. "The ledger should probably come here eventually. We can preserve it properly." Evelyn knew Nora was right. The hidden ledger was fragile. The toll house was still damp in places. Still awaiting foundation work, still capable of turning every rainstorm into a new expense. Yet the thought of removing the book from the room where Ruth had written it felt incomplete. "Can it be preserved there?" Evelyn asked. Nora considered the question. "With the right case, environmental control, and some professional help. But that costs money." Money. Evelyn almost laughed. Every road in her new life seemed to return to that word. That evening, Daniel was fitting reclaimed boards along an interior wall. Evelyn showed him Ruth's obituary. He read the final sentence and handed it back. "Sounds like she kept opening doors." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Apparently." Then she told him Nora's suggestion about moving the ledger permanently to the county archive. Daniel drove in another nail before answering. "Makes sense." "I know. You don't sound convinced." Evelyn looked around the toll room. Without the records, the building would still be historically interesting. But the ledger had transformed it from an abandoned structure into the place where a forgotten choice had happened. "I don't want this to become a museum I can't afford," she said. "I can't even pretend that's practical." "Then don't pretend." Daniel set down the hammer. "What do you actually want?" Evelyn started to answer with numbers. The foundation estimate, heating costs, her savings. Daniel shook his head. "Not what's safest. What do you want this place to be?" The question unsettled her because for most of her adult life, she had answered practical needs before desires. Work, rent, her mother's care, retirement. Even buying the toll house had begun as a desperate attempt to find somewhere cheap to live. She walked to the old counter. The brass Toll 7 plate caught the evening light. Beneath it were the marks someone had cut into the wood long ago. On the table sat copies of Ruth's receipts and the photograph of the final page with 27 entries. Evelyn imagined visitors seeing those documents here, looking through the same window Ruth had watched, understanding that history could be made by someone with no title and almost no money. "The records shouldn't disappear into another box," she said. Daniel waited. Evelyn placed her hand on the worn counter. The idea was financially difficult, perhaps inconvenient, and certainly not part of any retirement plan she had ever imagined, but for once, she knew what she wanted before she knew exactly how to afford it. "I think the records should stay where the story happened." Evelyn did not turn the toll house into a museum. The word sounded too large, too expensive, and too polished for what she wanted. Instead, she made a smaller plan. One room would remain open to visitors by appointment and on certain weekends. The ledger would stay in the building where Ruth had written it, protected inside a proper display case. Copies of the Vance letters, the payroll records, Thomas Calder's letter, and Ruth's obituary would provide the rest of the story. The county library agreed to help with preservation standards, and Nora found a modest local heritage grant that could cover part of the archival case and humidity control. Evelyn paid for the rest, carefully, one expense at a time. She kept the back rooms for herself. Daniel concentrated on the repairs that mattered most: the foundation, the roof, the damaged windows, and a safe heating system before winter. Whenever Evelyn worried aloud about money, he answered with practical questions instead of reassurance. "What has to be done now?" he would ask. "What can wait?" It became their method. The toll house slowly stopped looking abandoned. Not restored to perfection, not made new, but made sound. Harold Vance surprised Evelyn by returning with a folder of documents. "Copies," he said, "from the family archive." Inside were the letters ordering Ruth to close the gate, the termination notice, and several turnpike records that helped establish the timeline. "You can display them," he said. Evelyn studied him. "With your family name attached," Harold nodded. "If we're telling it accurately, then accurately means all of it." He did not apologize for people he had never known, and Evelyn did not ask him to. His willingness to stop protecting the old version was enough. Nora helped write the exhibit text, but Evelyn rejected anything that made Ruth sound larger than life. "She wasn't famous," Evelyn said. She wasn't trying to become famous in the end. The main card beside the ledger contained only a few lines. She collected the toll when they could not pay. She paid when she could no longer pay. She opened the gate anyway. The first public opening took place on a cool Saturday morning. Evelyn expected perhaps a dozen visitors. More came. Some were local residents who had driven past the building for years without knowing what it had been. Others came because Nora had shared the discovery through the Historical Society. Helen Ward arrived carrying a copy of Thomas Calder's letter and a framed photograph of the Calder family taken in Ohio years after they left Pennsylvania. Evelyn held the photograph with both hands. Thomas stood beside Margaret, older than he would ever have been if the memorial record had been correct. Their children stood in front of them. One of those children eventually became Helen's ancestor. They got a whole life after that road. Evelyn said. Helen nodded. Several generations of one. Evelyn looked toward the old gate outside. For the first time, the consequences of Ruth's actions felt visible in a way numbers never could. A few cents of unpaid toll had once meant the difference between being trapped and continuing west. Daniel had repaired the old wooden barrier using as much surviving material as possible. It no longer controlled traffic. The modern road had long since shifted away. Now it stood beside the house as a reminder of what the place had once been built to do. By afternoon, visitors moved quietly through the room, reading the letters and leaning close to the ledger case. Harold came too. He stood for a long time before the copy of his ancestor's order directing Ruth to lock the gate after dark. Then he moved to the final page containing 27 entries and said nothing when the last scheduled group left. Daniel found Evelyn behind the old toll counter. "Long day," he said. "Good long." He looked around the room. "So what do you call yourself now?" "What do you mean?" "Retired," Evelyn laughed. Months earlier, the word had frightened her. Retirement had sounded like subtraction: no job, no routine, no plan, less money, less certainty. Now she thought about mornings answering messages from descendants, afternoons helping Nora identify records, and evenings working beside Daniel on whatever part of the toll house still needed attention. She still had a limited income. The roof would need more work eventually. The grant money was not endless. Nothing about her future had become effortless. "I don't know," she said. Daniel smiled. "Seems fair." The answer did not scare her anymore. Evelyn had spent most of her life waiting for a better time to begin living differently. She would travel later, buy something later, research the family later, decide what she wanted later. Then at 61, with a cardboard box from work and a spreadsheet telling her how carefully she had to live. Later had arrived without instructions. The $300 toll house had not made her rich. It had given her bills, splinters, leaking walls, and more uncertainty than she had expected. It had also given her a reason to get up in the morning. Near sunset, a girl visiting with her grandmother lingered beside the restored barrier. Why didn't Ruth just follow the rules, she asked Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the old wood. Because the rules said people who couldn't pay shouldn't pass. But it was her job. It was... The girl waited. Evelyn thought of Ruth's sentence, "A debt should not become a wall." Sometimes a place is built to decide who gets through. Evelyn said, but the person standing at the gate still decides what kind of person they're going to be. The girl considered that, then ran to catch up with her grandmother. Evelyn remained outside. Daniel had finished fastening the final hinge earlier that week, and the barrier could now be raised and lowered again. She rested her hand on it. More than a century ago, Ruth had stood somewhere near this spot in the rain, lifting the gate for families who had almost nothing. Evelyn had spent weeks believing the mystery was hidden in missing payments, false records, and a family scandal. In the end, the truth was simpler. Ruth had seen people trapped by circumstances they had not chosen, and had used the little she possessed to help them move forward when money was no longer enough. She had still found one thing she could give them passage. Evelyn looked back through the toll house window. The ledger rested beneath glass where the story had happened. The room behind it glowed warmly, no longer abandoned, no longer silent. She thought about her own future and realized she no longer needed every year mapped out in advance. Purpose, she had learned, did not always arrive as a plan. Sometimes it arrived disguised as a ruined house no one wanted. Sometimes it cost $300 before going inside. Evelyn lifted the restored barrier and left it open.